God sending out invitations to people. Now, how many different types of people through verses 1 through 14 were identified? So, this is your hint. Um, is not specific religious people. So, it's not specifically Jews, it's not specifically Christians. Three types of people or categories. But what the well, hold on, because you're going ahead. Let's just focus on verse 3. We have to break it down because each verse talks about different people. I know you're in a row. I'm sorry. Us looking at verse 3. Mm-mm. So I'm gonna give you guys the answer for verse 3, and then I'm gonna have you guys take the lead for 5 and 6. So for verse 3, this is talking about the general call of salvation. So the wedding, so we know the wedding feast represents salvation, which is the call for us to accept what Jesus did on the cross and to accept him. So the first group of people are people who did not come. These are the these are the people who did not care about what happened to Jesus and did not want to accept Jesus or was not just even interested to know. Mm-mm. This is talking about in general. So this fits to even the modern times how we tend to talk to people and they just have no interest of hearing about about God. Now we're gonna look at verse 5. What what category of people is being talked about in verse 5? So as far as the characteristics of the people, what is it that's being pointed out? Yes and no. So you're on the right track. So it does have to do with money. So verse 5 is focusing on people who are more concerned about making money, who are more concerned about other things in general. So these are the people that that don't see an importance in God and they have everything else on earth that they put first and a higher priority than God. This is a second category. And then verse 6. So these people were called, but what was interesting about these people? Or what type of people is being talked about in verse 7? Or verse 6, sorry. No. The metaphor. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. So for YouTube, sorry for the long silent pause. So Pastor Rick was just given a explanation as to what verses uh 3 to 6 was talking about. So real quick, let me just repeat what he was saying. So verse 3 is so verse 3 is talking about the the first people that were given the invitation, that were giving the opportunity to accept Jesus, what he did on the cross. Um, but these people were the ones who just had no interest in knowing who God was and accepting him. And then in verse 4, we see where it mentions that it says, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatted cattle are killed, and all things are ready. So, this is a metaphor that is talking about the sacrifice that Jesus did to himself on the cross. And it's basically representing that our salvation, the access to heaven, is pretty much available. It's just people are choosing not to accept it. Verse 5 is talking about people who tend to put earthly things as a priority versus putting God as a priority. The main thing it talks about is money, but that can also include other things outside of God. And then verse 6 is talking about the people who hears God's words, hears people preaching, evangelists. They're hearing God's words, but they are responding with anger, with violence. They're killing God's people, and this is where we see that it talks about people being martyrs for sharing the gospel. And then we're going to go to verse 7. So, verse 7, yep, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, there's three different types. Yeah, so it's three. So it's talking about three different types of people, three different types of response that people have to deny the word of God that's being spread. All of them don't accept the gospel and don't accept God, but they're doing it in three different ways. You got people who just don't. So I guess you could kind of think of the first group as like atheists. They don't care what you say. They're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then the second group, you have people who, focus more on the worldly possessions. And then the third group, you have those that will just upright kill you for just spreading the gospel. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, with what Pastor Rick just mentioned, so a lot of what we're going to read is a lot of it's prophetic. A lot of it talks about the end times. It talks about now. It talks about after the rapture. So a lot of this, when we read, we have to read thinking of the later days and further. A lot of what we're reading is not necessarily a present tense thing when it was written, but it's present for like us now in the near future, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, and then everything that we've read from verses 2 to 7 so far are things that we're seeing now. We're going to see more of it. We're going to see more and more people denying God because of many, many different reasons. We're going to see a lot of people being killed for even just claiming that they believe in Jesus. So, this is basically, even when this was written, this is basically telling us how things were going to be for us and in the future. And then verses 9 to 13. So I'm going to read that real quick. So verses 9 to 13 says, "Therefore go into the highways, and as many and as many as you find, invite to the wedding." So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all who they found, both good, both bad and good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there who did not have on a wedding garment. So he said to him, "Friend, how did you come here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, "Bind him hand and foot, take him away and cast him into outer darkness. There there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen." Okay. Um so reading what was gonna be my question? Um so what is what does the wedding garment represent? Not the blood. Mm-mm. Doesn't specify. Mm-mm. It's something specific. Put a pin in that. Anybody want to take a guess? It's a specific word. But what does the garment represent? It's a specific word. So someone open up to Isaiah 61:10. Okay, go ahead and read that. Okay. Yep. So it's the robe of righteousness. It's not just salvation, because salvation could be a whole bunch of different things. So the robe specifically is the robe of righteousness. And this is also found in Romans 3:21 to 22. Let me pull that up real quick. So Romans 3. We're going to go over that. So write down Romans 3 verse 21 to 22. So that goes with the robe of righteousness, and that says God's righteousness is now revealed, not through the law, but through faith in Jesus. Okay, so when you hear that it's talking about the robe that's placed on us, it's righteousness by faith that is given to us by God. Okay. Romans 3, verse 21 to 22. Okay, so what this means. Okay, so who wants to answer? So what does righteousness given by God mean? What does that mean? Justin. Yeah. So that, and anyone else want to add? No, that comes a little bit later. But it's pretty much what Brother Donwood said. And having God's righteousness placed upon you, that's also um that's also God declaring that you're his child, that you're doing good under his eyes. So when it says that you have the robe of righteousness, that means that one, you have faith in God. Two, when God looks at you, he sees that you're doing things that you're supposed to be doing. You're following him, you're using your gifts, the whole 9 yards. God himself is saying that you are righteous through him. So when we look back at Matthew, I lost my place. Matthew, starting at verse 11. So when it says that this specific man didn't have the wedding garment, which is the robe of righteousness, this is saying that this man pretty much thought that he was righteous enough, or that he believed himself that he belonged there, that he's supposed to be there. He kind of just plopped himself in there himself. He wasn't actually invited by God. So that's why it's saying, why aren't you wearing the wedding garment? Why aren't you wearing the robe of righteousness? Saying that trying to basically you're basically trying to claim that you're following God, you're a child of God, and you're doing the works you're supposed to be doing. But what's being said here is that God never said you are, so you're not welcome here. So that's why we see in verses 13 where it says that the king, which is God, tells the servants to bind him hand and foot, take him away, and cast him into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, which we all know that represents hell. Okay, so if you don't have the robe of righteousness, then in God's eyes, you're basically not living the way you're supposed to, and that will lead you ultimately to hell. Okay, so that's what this last person represents. And then this also goes in with people who believe that doing good deeds will get them into heaven. This is what this also represents. And you guys can also find this in Philippians chapter 3, verse 4 to 9. Okay, so we all know good deeds or good works does not get you into heaven, and that's what this specific man thought would happen, but ultimately led him the other way. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that pretty much what you said leads to the last verse of this section, which is 14. So this says, "For many are called, but few are chosen." So this is pretty much saying God calls everyone. He wants everyone to end up in heaven, okay? But the ones who were truly chosen to be there are the ones who respond to the invitation. So what that means is that yes, he may want everyone to be there, but only few people will actually take the invitation and make it there. And then a reference verse that you guys can write down for this is Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3. And this says, ignoring the salvation offered through Jesus Christ will lead to punishment. Mm-hmm. Yep, many, I think it's the one you referred to, is many will say, Lord, Lord, but then he'll say, I do not know you. Yep. So he definitely warns us plenty of times about this specific subject. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. To be considered an actual servant of God, you have to have, there can't be no pauses, no guessing, no, thinking if you want to do it, don't want to do it. You have to be 100% committed, be willing to sacrifice whatever it takes, and doing whatever it is that God tells you to do so that you can help Him bring people to heaven. Any questions with verses 1 to 14? All right, so then we're going to look at the next section, which is verses 15 to 22. So this one specifically talks about the Pharisees and the question that they wanted to ask is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Okay. um okay. So um so looking at verse 17 specifically, so when the Pharisees say, tell us therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So here, what they are referring to when they're talking about the law, they're talking about, is it lawful in God's eye? So they're trying to ask Jesus to see if he gives a specific answer, because whichever answer they give, if he says yes or no, they're going to try to turn that against him. So to give you guys some background, so the reason why the Pharisees asked a specific question of is it lawful in God's eye is because back then, as we read a couple times, Jews did not like paying taxes, more specifically taxes to the Romans. Okay? And remember, this is because they were paying money to their oppressors. They were paying money to the person or the people that were making it difficult in their lives. Okay? So this is pretty much the reason why they hated paying taxes and hated all the tax collectors. And then in verses 18 to 22, we see Jesus' response. And then he starts off his response by basically saying, why put me to the test? Calls him a hypocrite and then says, why even put me to the test? And then he asks them, whose image is on the coin? And then the Pharisees respond that Caesar's face is on the coin. Then Jesus says, then give the things that are Caesar's to Caesar, and God's things to God. Okay, So basically, he's saying you have to separate the two. So whatever rules, whatever things you have to do on Earth, as far as taxes, laws, and all that stuff, you have to follow, and then you also have to follow God's law as well. Okay, so he didn't necessarily say it was right or wrong. He's just saying you got earthly rules and laws, you got to follow that, but then you have God's laws, and you need to follow that as well. Okay. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So that's actually the last thing I I had written in my notes. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Nothing is new. Mhm.
I don't have 10% of my crops to be able to give to God, or 10% of an animal to give to God, or anything like that. He's like, well, he said, the Bible doesn't say I need 10% of a specific item. I said I need 10% of what you work for.
Mm-hmm.
The sweat of your brow is 10% of what I want from you, not 10% of a specific item. Because if it was a specific item, we would still be cutting up the cattle. You know what I mean? So I think it's smart, because God still says, even though something belongs to the government, 10% of it I demand that it belongs to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So pretty much with this. So so yeah, so basically with this, it's basically preparing us, and it's helping us to not get attached to the material things. Okay. And then with this is telling us that all these material things on earth belong to, air quotation, Caesar or the enemy, but we ourselves, who are children of God, belong to God. Okay. Verses 22 to 33. So here talks about the Sadducees. I think that's how you say it. Sadducees, whatever. You know, I can't pronounce words. Sadducees. And their question is, what about the resurrection? Okay. So, just to give you guys some background as to why this specific question is so weird coming out of the Sadducees' mouth. So, I think we kind of went over this a couple months back, but the Sadducees only believed and accepted the last 5 books of the Old Testament. So they did not believe in angels, they didn't believe in demons, and they didn't believe in the afterlife. So this is where the term atheist kind of originates from. Okay, so these specific groups of people don't believe in angels, demons, or the afterlife. So for them to ask a question about the resurrection is kind of like, why are you asking about this question when it's something you don't even believe in? So they're kind of being smart butts. Yeah. Yeah. So they asked this interesting question, and we see that Jesus responds in verse 29. He responds by saying, they do not know the scripture or the power of God. So he starts off by pretty much putting them right on the spot and correcting them. Okay. And then in verse 30, Jesus says, in heaven, wait, no, I think that's, yeah. Okay, no, this is separate. So that's like the main thing. So just to give you guys some more clarity as to what the question was asked, it says, if a man dies having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offsprings of his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So, to put this in quick words, 1 female married all 7 brothers. So their question is, therefore in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 shall she be? For they all had her. Basically, they all married her. So then that's when he says they don't know the scripture, they don't know the power of God. And then verse 30, he puts in there and says that in heaven we are not married to our spouse from earth, and that we will be like angels who also do not marry. Okay? So you got to be careful with verse 30 because this is something a lot of people like to twist. We are not going to be angels. He got enough angels. We're never going to be angels. Okay? So if anybody ever tells you, oh, you die, you're going to be an angel, that's false. Putting that out there. So what he is saying is we're going to be like the angels, because the angels don't get married. They don't have relations and babies and all that stuff. So pretty much we're going to mimic how the angels live in heaven. So there's no going to be you're married to this person, married to that person, this person's your child, and blah, 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 blah. That's not going to exist. And then in 31 to 33, Jesus used, so he used the present tense word to describe God's relationship to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I'm just going to look at 31 to 33 real quick. So verse 32 specifically. Wait, no. Sorry, I'm going to just read 30 to 33. So it says, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am, that's the present tense, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So here we see that he also throws in that he says, I am the God. So right there, he's telling us that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are in his presence, and that he was and still is their God. Okay, so he kind of throws that in there a little bit spiritual. He throws that in there. Any questions with verses up to verse 33 so far? So there's a couple different things that were mentioned in these verses. Everyone good? Okay. And then 34 to 40. So this is one of the little shorter ones. So this one talks about the scribes. And their question is, which is the first commandment of all? So just to let you guys know that in 35, when it says, then one of them, a lawyer, is not a lawyer that we have now that defends you in court and all that stuff. So back then, their definition of a lawyer was someone who was an expert in the law of Moses. Okay, so this was someone who claimed to know the ins and outs of all the laws that Moses has put. Okay, so this is who's speaking to Jesus right now. So then we see that in 36, he says, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And then we see that Jesus responds and pretty much tells him and us that you will love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first commandment. The second commandment is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So he's basically giving him the two things that if you follow the first one, that you have no issues following the second, the third, the fourth, and so on and so forth. Okay? Verse 41 to 46. So here we see that then Jesus asks the Pharisees a question. And his question is, how can David call his descendants Lord? Okay. And then we see that he says in 42, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And then the Pharisees respond that he is the son of David. And 43 says, he said to them, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare to question him anymore. So basically, you know how a lot of people, yeah, he put him down with that. But sorry, my butt is numb. I said that on YouTube. So basically, what he is saying is that he's there we go. So he's basically saying that their belief that the Messiah would come from the descendant of David and would be like an actual flesh and this huge king and castle and blah, 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 blah. Jesus is basically saying, how can the Messiah be this son of David if even David himself calls him Lord? Okay? So he's basically saying what they're believing is completely false. Yeah, he's basically telling them that their Messiah is not going to be of flesh. It's someone that's going to save them spiritually, transform them. But the people of this time, and even now, a lot of people believe that the Messiah would be someone that gets born of flesh and, rich and blah, 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 when we all know that's false. Yep. And we're going to talk about that. That's a good transition. So, yes. So, okay, real quick before I get to that. So, verse 44, this is actually a verse from Psalms 110. Okay, so he quotes another passage of Psalms. And based off of what we said, that Jesus uses the present tense and he acknowledges that he is Lord, that he was there in the beginning, he's there now, he'll be there at the end. This goes with Revelations 22:13. So let me just pull this up real quick. 22 verse 13. So this is one of the more famous or well-known scriptures where it says, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. So just to give you guys just an interesting fact, just so you can know, you can write it down, you can share it with someone. So in Greek, Alpha is the first letter of the alphabet, and Omega is the last letter of the alphabet. So there he throws in more examples that he is the beginning and the end. Okay. Any questions with Matthew 22? No? All right, so let's move on to Matthew 23. Oh, wow, it's been an hour. Okay, as long as you're learning. All right, Matthew 23. Okay, so verses 1 to 36 all goes together. Excuse me. So this talks about woe to the scribes and Pharisees. So here in this section, so throughout 1 to 36, excuse me, we see that Jesus is pretty much confronting the man-made religion that was made by the Pharisees and the leaders of this time. There we go. Okay. So in verse 2 to 3, he starts by saying and confronting the leaders, saying that they say one thing but do another. And this is something that we've talked about in previous chapters, where the Pharisees tend to make up a lot of rules and laws for the people, but they themselves don't follow. And we see more of this in verse 4, where it says, "For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." Okay, so here is being said that these leaders have made laws and rules and mixed them with what was the true laws and rules of God, and they're making it such a burden for the people to handle. They're making it hard for them to keep up with the rules and the laws. And the scripture you guys can write down for this is Matthew 11, verse 29 to 30. And then 6 to 7, we see where it's mentioned that some of the leaders even tend to reserve seats in the synagogue. And this is something that not all specific Jewish religions, I'm not sure if anyone else outside of that does it, but some have this thing where if you pay monthly a specific price, they'll pretty much hold a specific seat within the synagogue, and that would be like your assigned seat since you paid for it. So this is something that happened back then and something that's happening now. It just shows, well, because usually they would buy the ones up front, and it kind of shows like, hey, I can afford it, yeah, kind of basically trying to flaunt the money and status that they have. And that leads to verse 12, where it says, "And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Okay? So if you are not humbled yourself, God will humble you. But if you are humbled in the first place, then he will exalt you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the more you have, at the end of the day, we got to remember everything we have is given to us by God. So if we tend to give ourselves praise, we use it for the things that are not of God, he'll definitely make an example out of you. And I just want to point out verse 14. Depending on the translation you have, some Bibles might have verse 14 there, some Bibles may not. It might just say 14 and skip right to 15. So this is depending on the manuscript. So we talked about this a while ago, how the different translation Bibles that we use all come from different Greek translations or Greek scribes from many, 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 many years ago. So it's not that Bibles are purposely taking verses out, is that these specific translations are using a specific Greek um, scribe. And depending how it was translated back then, it might be a couple things that were not written, or um, depending who wrote it, depending when, and all that stuff, depending how it was translated. Because remember, Greek was not the first way it was written; that was also translated from the original language. So depending how they translated it, they probably could have translated it wrong. So just want to point that out. Depending on your translation, you may or may not have verse 14 there. But verse 14 says that the leaders took advantage of the widows. Okay. And we know that this is one of the things that is a no-no to do. And then verse 15, I don't know how to pronounce this word. Verse 15, the word proselyte, whatever that word is, Proselyte. Does anyone know what that is? So what does that mean? So this is someone who doesn't know the word and is basically new. What's my note? Yeah, someone who is newly converted. So, for an example, someone who would become like a new believer, that would be the term that they used back then. So, in verse 15, what it's saying, Jesus is basically pointing out how some of the leaders would go out, find new people, convert them, but then they would teach them false words. So he's saying you're going out and finding people and converting them, and you're teaching them the wrong things. So he's pointing that out so that they're aware that that's something they definitely should not be doing. I wouldn't say them specifically, because it can pretty much go with anyone that teaches anything false. Because even in the Christian religion, there's people who preach false word. So it's pretty much anyone that would teach false anything. Yeah. All the leaders. They follow the law of Moses, but they like to add their own little rules in there to benefit themselves. That's why That's why it says in the beginning that Jesus is confronting their man-made laws. So he's saying, these are the laws I gave you, but instead of you just teaching this, you're adding a whole bunch of laws that you guys made to benefit you. And it's stuff that is false. Mm-hmm. Okay. So anytime you guys see that word, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to newly converted people. And then verse 16 to 22. So here Jesus addresses and ridicules how this is something that's done even now, but he ridicules how people were swearing an oath to be looked at as they were telling the truth. So what this is talking about is people who say, they'll be like, "Oh, I swear on the Bible that I didn't do this," and blah 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 blah. So he's talking about people who swear and people who use God's name in vain. He's saying that this is something that should not be done. And if you read verses 16 to 22, he's saying that people had made it pretty much a practice that it was okay to do this so that people would believe that they were actually telling the truth. And he's saying this is something that you shouldn't be doing. Hmm. What do you mean? Like the hand on the thing? Yeah, it's because that's something that was done way, way back, and they just kind of kept it. So yeah, that's where that most likely originated from. So yeah, so anything that has to do with any type of swearing is a no-no. You shouldn't be doing it, especially if it's anything that has to do with using God in it. And then in verse 23 to 24, talks about. Sorry. So verse 23 to 24, he addresses the traditions to the elders that they should be tithing what they own and pretty much not what they're picking and choosing to tithe. He's basically saying that you should be tithing the 10% and not just pretty much giving whatever it is that they feel like giving because it's not something of value of them. One second. We got a comment on YouTube. This heart is in the way. I thought there were boxes. Verses just show how holy they are at what they. Similar to someone always having their Bible on them but not following the scripture inside. Yeah. So I think you're referring to what we just went over. Lydia. She's on YouTube. Yeah, so she wrote some similar to someone always having their Bible on them but not following the scripture inside. So this could definitely be an example of what we just went over. Trying to see. So if you can, just write down what verse specifically that comment was for, just so I can go back and look at it. Okay. And then alright, well, that was in 23. Okay. And then 25 to 28. So this is another thing that we touched on before. So this talks about you having to be cleaned from within, which includes the way you think, the way things coming from your heart, the ways you speak, the way you carry yourself. So this is what's important, is you being clean from the inside and not just focusing on your outward appearance. So like how you dressed, how you dressed, how you kind of appear to people. What he's saying is that you can look like the cleanest person ever, but if inside you're still judgmental, you're still angry, you're still all this other stuff, then pretty much your outward appearance means nothing. So you have to make sure you're looking at your inward appearance. Matthew 23:5. Let me just go back real quick. Yeah. Yeah. So this was okay, so in verse 5 she's referring to the I don't know how to even say that word. Yeah, that word. So that was a leather box that they carried around that had Hebrew text in it. And they would carry it around with them and it basically just reminded them of the laws. And Lydia's comment was basically saying that's similar to now how people carry around the Bible but don't actually read it or follow what's in it. That's a good thing to bring up. Um and then yeah. And then 29 to 36. So this talks about um so here Jesus addresses that the leaders were saying that if they lived back in a day with the prophets of their fathers, that they would never have killed them and they would have listened to them. And he responds by pretty much telling them um that well, first he calls them vipers or serpents, and then he basically tells them that what they're claiming is false because they currently are putting their prophet and even the Messiah to death. So he's saying you would do even worse than what they did because you're doing it even now. Okay? So basically shutting them down with that claim of theirs. And then the last of this chapter is going to be verses 37 to 39. And this is Jesus' laments over Jerusalem. Yes, he's crying. He's weeping. So basically verses 37 to 39. This is Jesus speaking prophetic. So in these verses, Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple that's going to happen in 30 years by the Romans. And the words that he's speaking here is also found in Psalms 118. So he definitely like to use a lot of the Psalms. And then as we're reading, we can definitely see the pain that he feels when he is speaking. And another place that we see where he's weeping over Jerusalem is in Luke 19, verses 41 to 44. Any questions with chapter 23? Yeah, basically saying they're pretty much on the same path as the people um as their peoples in the years of their fathers. So all right, so let's move on to Mark chapter 12. Okay. So verses 1 through 12 of Mark chapter 12 talks about the parable of the wicked vine dressers. So what does the vineyard represent? So based off of the current time that we're reading about. Yep. So the vineyard is the nation of Israel. And who are the tenants that are being talked about in here? Mm-mm. So the Jews are the vineyard, is the vineyard. So who are the tenants? The leaders. Yep. So the vineyard is the nation of Israel. The tenants are the leaders of Israel. And who's the landowner? Is God. Yep. So now that you guys know what those represent, now you'll kind of get a little bit more insight as to how to read these verses. So the vineyard is the nation of Israel, the tenants are the leaders of Israel, and the landowner is God. So verses 2 to 8. So here we read that the servants that were killed and mistreated were the prophets. And these were the prophets that were sent over to talk to the people and the leaders by God. So I also want to point out that throughout 2 to 8, we see that it mentions that God repeatedly over the years continued to send out different prophets to the people. What? I'm a pop quiz. What fruit of the Spirit is God showing us here? Not gift, fruit. And we talked about this. What fruit of the Spirit is God showing by continuing to send prophets to the people to try to get saved? Long suffering. So here, this is referring to God's long suffering. So even though he's patient, he's being patient with the people. He's waiting for the people to come. But through this waiting, he's getting hurt because the people continue to deny him, continue to kill those that are his children that he sent out to the people. This is an example of long suffering. So even God himself shows us that specific fruit of the Spirit. And this is something that a lot of us tend to struggle with. So here, even God himself is saying long suffering is important to have. In verses 9 to 12, so here we see where it talks about the stone which the builders reject has become the chief cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So here, Jesus is speaking of himself as the stone. And he is telling the people he is telling them that they continue to reject him. And then, so some other verses you guys can write down that also talk about Jesus referring to himself as the cornerstone is Acts chapter 4, verse 11. And 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5 through 7. And then also verses 10 and 11, or really 11, is also from Psalms 118. Okay, so she said he is showing patience. So does anyone remember what the difference is of having patience and having long suffering? We also went over this when we went over the fruits of the spirits. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So patience is waiting for something. Long long suffering is it includes patience, so includes waiting, but with that you're also suffering at the same time. So mhm. So these two are actually two different fruits of the spirits. Um no. So an example of long suffering would be um if I can give an example. So long suffering would be, let's say, that's not really long suffering. That would more go under the category of just martyr because mhm. Lydia, so to answer your question, yeah, it's the same thing for forbearance and long suffering. It just depends on the translation that you use, but they're both the same thing. So real quick. So patience, so just to give you guys a little bit more. So just to give you guys a little bit more. So again, patience has to do more with uh waiting. So it has to do with more like time, being patient in a sense of that's more like short term. You're kind of dealing with difficult situations. You're trying to stay calm, but it's more of like a short term type of thing. Forbearance or long suffering, it stems from patience, but this is more you holding on to not reacting. So you're suffering for longer periods of time. Um, you're you're not lashing out. You're not being angry. That's what that is. Does that make sense? So it's kind of the same thing. It's kind of has the same foundation, but patience is more short term. It has to do with you just kind of just waiting without kind of giving any like complaints. You're just like, oh, okay, let me. For example, like if you're waiting in a long line, like if you're waiting in a long line and you're just like, oh, all right, it's a long line, and we just wait here. Like you're trying not to complain. Long suffering is like, for an example, would be yeah. So it would be something that's more difficult to handle. Is something that's more difficult for you to forgive. It's something that normally would trigger a person to get angry and to rebel, but you hold such a composure that you're like, okay, I'm gonna deal with it. I'm not gonna get out of character. It's fine. I'm gonna let it go. That's kind of what those two differences are. Yeah. Yeah.
So, like the example I gave, like when I was seeing the other ones with long suffering, I was seeing a sense of like you said, based off of what they how they react and what they do. So in that situation, it's deny Christ or this going to keep happening, even though they don't want it to keep happening. Their long suffering is even though they're witnessing these things happening to their families to them, they're staying strong for God.
Well, yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's still long suffering.
Yeah.
I would say still preaching. Imagine
Excuse
you're
me.
somehow you are untouchable, right? Imagine like you can't be killed, right, Josh? Like, imagine you can't be killed, but everyone around you can be killed. You know, like your wife can be killed, your kids can be killed, and you're preaching to the people who are killing your family. But the fact that you're not trying to save them or stop them or do anything, you're only trying to preach the word to them. You still have mercy for those people because you're saying like you're enduring it. You're not enduring it. You still want to save them. So I would say like what came into my mind was the fact that God almost destroyed the whole earth again in Exodus, but Moses held him back. In the desert when they first came, he was like, whenever they got to the desert and they were being again, they were being a certain way, like ungrateful, and he was like, and then Moses told him, what would Egypt or everyone say that you destroyed them all in the middle of the desert? Because and then God was, God. So then God had to repent himself in order to be able to endure the people's grumbling, in order to give them what they want and to make his point come across. Because he was trying to say that I saved them, and then I'm going to give them what I promised is that they're still hurting me because they're not accepting the gifts I gave them. You know what I mean? Like that's a long suffering. But doesn't that more like hurt people? You know what I mean? But it's more of a they're rejecting me. I'm still gonna help them. They're rejecting me, but I'm still gonna help them. God's not being persecuted. You know what I mean? God's not losing anything. He's losing his patience, but he's not losing anything. Like almost like but I'm thinking of it spiritually, like he's losing his people because by them going against him, he's losing that love and connection between his creation, and they're like condemning themselves. You know, because then that's the reason he sent Jesus. So that's why like it was long suffering for him because they were basically condemning themselves by going against God and like continuously. So God's in constant long suffering. Yeah. Because of these people, but we're not in long suffering because if the family. I'm asking you a personal question. Like, am I in long suffering because my family dies during persecution? That's not long suffering. That's persecution. Well, no, not that they die. I'm saying like if they're threatening lose something else, and then do it again, and then keep losing something else, and then do it again.
But what instead of the preaching, isn't it not denying Christ? So like whether you're still preaching or not, but you're not denying, you're staying firm.
That's not a long suffering because you you denying or not denying is not mercy towards the person killing you, towards the person torturing you.
So you're saying long suffering
It's
has to
for
be
the
like
person,
you have to
not
have
for you.
mercy for the person.
Correct.
Yeah,
It's not
so
for you, it's for them.
yeah, so patience is more so the main thing patience is the waiting aspect. Long suffering or forbearance, depending on what translation you have, is more you actively showing the patience through the hardship.
Slapping of the other cheek is long
So
suffering. Jesus is slapping of the
So
yeah,
both
turning the cheek.
other people, not really for you. Okay.
yeah, so it's like the example Pastor Rick gave. It's like when the time of I'm going blank. But like when people start to just killing people in the church, long suffering, like he said, would be you see people killing your family, and instead of you condemning them, you're like, okay, me as a child of God, I'm still gonna preach to the same people who killed my family. So it's more forbearance and long suffering is more you showing the patience and being active and not letting stuff affect you and not letting the character of God to leave you. That's what that is. Patience is more you're kind of just like being passive. Yeah.
Because God still loves them and still tries to give mercy, even though rejection and murder of the prophets.
Yeah. Patience is more you're being passive. Like you're not actively doing anything. You're kind of just like letting stuff. You're like, okay. Where long suffering and forbearance, you're actively showing that you're gonna continue with showing the characteristics of God and not letting stuff bother you. You had a question, Jesse? Um, mm, if it was more, if it was more affecting the parent, then yeah, because since the parent is not directly like yeah, as your child, you're seeing them, but since the parent is not actually getting affected by it, like they themselves are not losing their house, their health, their finances. Since they're fine and they're kind of just looking at their child do whatever, it doesn't really fall under that. Kind of falls under something else. Yeah, no, that's not long suffering. That's just them being enablers.
I like
Sure.
So it's like that's what we were talking about. Like is the way I look at it is like God was patient because the people didn't like accept. And then I think like the long suffering was him seeing his prophets go in there and die, but he still had to have patience, even though he kept sending them in there. He knew that they were dying, like he was
Mm-hmm.
suffering, like that was hurting him, that they still wouldn't accept the word of God through the prophets.
Yep. So the example in Mark 12, the long suffering, like you said, comes from God sees his prophets getting killed, but over the years he still keeps sending them. He keeps sending them. So that's his example of showing long suffering, because yeah, he sees his people getting killed, but he continues to show the love, to show the kindness, shows the patience, to show the grace and mercy, even though they continue to do what they're doing.
not more, but like more long suffering for really, since they get like a second chance, even
Yeah, those are his chosen people. Yeah, that's not even a. That's not even a. What is it? Yeah. And then Lydia gave a good example that Job is a good example of forbearance. She said Yeah, tell me when you're responding. All right, we're gonna skip over that since you already responded. So any questions with verses 1 through 12? I know that was a lot. Everyone's good? Okay. So then that leads to verses 13 to 17. So here, so pretty much the rest of 12 is stuff that we talked about already. So verses 13 to 17, this is all, well, for the rest of the chapter, stuff we read in Matthew 22, but 13 to 17, it talks about the Pharisees and these words, Herodians. I'm gonna go with that. So remember, these two specific groups did not like each other. They despised each other. So the fact that in this verse they're coming together to pretty much try to accuse Jesus and all that, it shows the amount of dislike that they had for Jesus. The fact that these two enemies came together to try to throw off Jesus in these verses. And then the rest of the sections is the same thing. They asked a question about the resurrection, the first commandment. So the only difference I want to point out is in verse 28 to 34 when it talks about the scribes. So the one thing that Mark mentions that Matthew doesn't is that Mark mentions a conversation that Jesus had with one of the scribes. And this specific scribe actually acknowledges who Jesus was, and Jesus' response was that the man was not far from the kingdom of God. So he's basically telling the man that he's following the right path and that he pretty much can make it to heaven. He just gotta, kind of fix a couple little things here and there. So that's the only key difference there. And then 38 to 40, we see that it talks about beware of the scribes. So this is basically just talking about false teachers. And these are false teachers who hold an importance to material things, and they take advantage of the poor and the widows, and these specific people will have great judgment. And then 41 to 44 talks about the widow who has two, I want to say mites, whatever it is. So this is something we've talked about a couple times. This is the lady that she had the two, what is it called? Yeah, the two mites, which basically equals up to about a penny. So this woman was someone who was very poor, and even though this is all that she had, she gave it up as an offering. Meanwhile, you had these other people who had a whole bunch of money, and they were putting out offerings to God, but it was coming from an arrogant place. Since they had so much money, they weren't really losing anything because they had so much of it. Meanwhile, this widow, mind you, since she's a widow, she doesn't have anyone to support her. Back then, women needed men to provide for them. So this is one of the reasons why she didn't have money to give for offerings. So the fact that she literally gave everything to God, this is something that he noticed. And this is where he says that So this is where he says that when we're giving to him from a humble place, That's something that he's acknowledging, and that's the way to get closer to heaven, because we're doing stuff from the heart, and we're actually our offering is actually affecting us. It's actually something we're sacrificing, and not something we're giving and not really losing anything from giving. So this shows that the value of our gifts or offering is determined by how much it costs us. Yes. Well, it would have to kind of hold the same. It would have to be in the same standard, in the sense of, if someone who is rich and well off, if they're giving, and it doesn't have to be just like tithe and offering, because or just tithe. Offering could be money. It could be them developing into communities. It's just a whole bunch of different stuff. But if they're giving to the point that they're actually feeling it, like the amount that they gave is affecting them, then that's a start. That doesn't necessarily mean just with that they're automatically in heaven, because that goes under good deeds. It's that included with the from where you're giving it. If it's from your heart and you're truly like, I really want to give this to God, I want it to make the church big and this and that and blah blah blah, but then you're also changing on the inside, the way you treat people. You're not, let's be honest, a lot of rich people have a stigma of just being very snotty and just not the best people. So if you're actually treating people how God treated, you have love for everyone. You don't treat anyone different because they have less than you. Just all that stuff comes into account. Mm-hmm.
Is it in those moments that God sees it, or is it the fact that I still have more to be able to give that God sees it?
The first one, because remember, God's not gonna want us to be in a position either where we're making ourselves homeless. He still wants us to take care of ourselves. So the fact that you're even acknowledging and you're like, God, like, I'm sorry, like, this is all I can give you, like, I wish I could give you more. The fact that you have that in your heart, he sees that. And he sees that you're still giving with a loving heart, and that you want to do more, and you just have a lot of other stuff that you need to do to maintain, because we still have to maintain our lives on earth, but at the same time have that balance to where we're not neglecting him and putting him to the side. Answers your question? Well, that's a balance that you have to have. Yeah, because if you have rent to pay, if you have bills that you have to pay, those are things that you have to pay in order to live on earth, right? So if something happens that you're out of work for such amount of time, you're not getting enough money to where if you pay your bills, you'll have enough, exactly 10% for whatever. If you're short to 10%, you don't want to give. You don't want to. So this is where the habit and the routine comes into play. You don't want to just be given a 10% to be like, oh, I have to give my 10%. No, you have to be willing to really want to give that 10% and not be doing it out of obligation. So the fact that this is something that he commands, and you're talking to him and you're like, God, like, I know you require 10% from me, but like I can't. Like I wish I could do more. And he sees that. He knows what's in your heart. He knows that it's your true intention to want to give more. It's just with other things happening, you just can't. Whatever it is that comes to you, you know. Go ahead.
And say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, well, yeah, this one, that was some things. Because God, not everyone, but most of the time, God gives us more than we deserve. He gives us just enough of everything, plus more. So it's like those other times where you do have a bit extra money, you're really, like you said, you cater to pastor, then make sure you give your 10% to God and don't try to make excuses like, oh, well, that's for me, and oh, but I got all these to pay. Or use the money first, then be like, oh, but I only got enough for bills now. You know what I mean? So, like,
Mm-hmm.
as long as you don't use it as an excuse as well. A lot of people do that, like, go through something one time and it's like, oh, well, I gotta still do this and it's still hard and I'm just making it. You know what I mean? It's not always.
Yeah, if you start to make it a habit of not giving what you're supposed to give, at the end of the day, you can lie to the church and be like, oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, God knows what you're going through. And He knows why you're giving what you're giving. So at the end of the day, you're shorting Him for whatever reason. And if that, whatever it is you're using the money for, is more important than your salvation, then that's between you and God at the end of the day. Any other questions? So we're going. So I know I had you guys read Luke 20. So we're gonna skip all of 20 because that pretty much is the same thing that we talked about. The parable of the wicked vine dressers, the Pharisees, Sadducees, beware of the scribes. It talks about pretty much the same thing. So we're gonna skip to Luke 21. And then we're gonna jump down to verse 5 because verse 1 through 4 talks about the widow again. Yeah. And then verse 5 and 6 talks about Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple. So here, okay, so this is a chapter where you really have to be careful reading because a lot of what we're going to read has the law of double reference that we talked about. So a lot of it talks about present tense in their time, and then it also talks about future tense. So an example of this is in 5 and 6 when he talks about the destruction of the temple. So the first thing he's referring to is the temple being destroyed by the Romans. That happens 30 years from when this is being written or when he's speaking. And it's also foreshadowing the Great Tribulation. So Luke 21 is actually an introduction to Jesus talking a little bit more about the tribulational period. And then verses 7 to 19. So here talks about the signs of the times and the end of the ages. Excuse me. So verse 7 through 9. So here we see that the disciples talk about or ask, when will the end of time be? And Jesus responds by telling them and us that we have to make sure that we're being aware of false prophets and of people claiming to be the false Messiah. So these are so he doesn't tell them exactly when, he just mentions signs that will happen. So it would be people saying that they're prophets when they're false, and then later on, people claiming that they're false, that they're the Messiah, when that is not true. Verses 10 to 11, he pretty much just talks about how the intensity of the hardship for us is going to get worse. So even though we may think it's difficult now, things are going to get a whole lot worse. And then 12 to 19, Jesus is talking again about the fall of the temple at his present time. And then it also mentions that the people will talk, and those who do not like the gospel will not like them for the words that they speak, which is something that we see now, where we see a lot of preachers, missionaries, evangelists. They're going out on the streets speaking the gospel, and we're seeing more and more people who are becoming angry and denying the word that's being spoken. And then more specifically looking at verses 17 to 19, he's saying that we may die on earth, but we will not lose our eternal life in heaven. So he's basically telling us, don't fear death on earth, because you're going to have eternal life in heaven. Yep. 19. Mm-hmm. Yep. So the first couple verses talk about his present time, and then I think starting from, I think it's 14. That's, wait, no. 12. That's where we see a lot of stuff that pertains to us now. Even where we're even in verse 11, where it talks about the earthquakes, the famine, all that stuff is stuff that we're seeing now. We're hearing about just different types of diseases that are coming. We see like the different types of floods that are happening. So all of that is both present and future tense. Mm-hmm. It Yeah, that is something that no one knows for sure. So some say that we won't be here when the famine and all that stuff happens. Some say we will be. We're not 100% sure. What we do know is that we may go through some of it, because I forget where specifically it says that us as Christians, we're going to go through the birth pains, which means we are going to feel some of it. We just don't know to what extent. So that's why we say it's important to make sure you're good and you're where you are with your faith, that whatever it is that does come, nothing is going to stray us away from denying God, because we're not necessarily sure how bad it's going to get for us before he decides to take us up. It's not necessarily the order, because again, we don't really know. Like, I know here it says before all these things, they'll do this, they'll do that, but we don't really know like 100% how it's going to be. It's just stuff that he's naming that is going to happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it talks about like the war, the plan, not to panic. I think this was more like signs that for us, like to open, like for us to open our eyes.
Well, that's it's signs for us to know that at any second the rapture could happen. So the more it can happen even during our class, but the more we see happening, that means it's even that much closer. So again, we don't know to what extent we're gonna feel everything. That's why it says to always be ready. You know that the rapture would be like a thief in the night. It will just come out of nowhere. You won't even expect it. So that's why we have to make sure we're always ready because we don't really know what he wants us to go through before he actually take us.
So, I don't really know this is not to judge people, but do you think that if people turn to God once they see these things happening, do you think because it's more out of fear, they still might not make it to heaven? Or more so as long as no matter how they come to God, even if it was because they fear wasn't a world within people. You know what I mean? Like, what do
Yeah,
you think?
yeah. So that is kind of the same thing as people accepting God on their deathbed. So just because you see all these signs and wonders and you're like, oh, okay, I believe you, God, I accept you, it doesn't mean that they truly believe Him because they're just doing it out of fear and because they've heard if you accept God, then you'll be saved. So it really just depends on your personal relationship with Him and where your acceptance is coming
That goes back to the guy with the rope.
from.
It goes like back to that. Like,
Yeah, that's why it says I gotta find a verse, but it says to not wait to the last minute because if you're waiting till the last minute, he's most likely not going to hear you. So that's why you gotta make sure we're good now and not waiting for that. Yeah. Um. And then so verse 20 to 24. So this talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. So so again, we're seeing the law of double reference. So verse 20 is talking about what happened in 70 AD. So this is when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And just to give you guys some facts, during this event and destruction, about 1.1 million Jews were killed by the Romans. Mm-hmm. So imagine yep, if you were a Jew, they pretty much killed you. And that's why it says in verse 23, it says, but woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. So they were killing women, children. If you were a Jew, they were killing you. No pun intended. Kind of rhymed. Um, I mean, probably not as much, but a lot of them relocated, repopulated, so it's possible. But just to give you guys an idea of the severity of what happened during 70 AD. And verse 20 is also mentioning the Great Tribulation. So the Great Tribulation. So this is talking about. So this is talking about before the second coming of Jesus. So remember, the Great Tribulation is after the rapture. The Jews are still down here. They're dealing with the Antichrist and all that stuff. So the temples are going to be destroyed. The Jews are still going to be persecuted. The Jews are going to be the one that's mainly targeted because remember, Satan's on earth and he knows the Jews are God's chosen people. So double reference in the first couple verses. So verses 20 to 24. And then 24. So this is talking about, I'm going to read 24. So 24 says, "And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be laid away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So this is talking about how since the fall of Jerusalem, they have never been they've never been in full control of themselves. So they've always had Gentiles, so anyone who's not a Jew, they've always had Gentiles ruling them. Okay, so that's pretty much everyone. The Romans, the Babylonians, everyone. And the last nation to technically rule over them was Britain, and this ended in 1948. So even though they technically weren't ruled by a nation, they still did not have full control of Jerusalem, and that's something that we see even to today. So the times of the Gentiles, so this will come to an end once God comes during the second coming, when he brings us down and does the battle of Armageddon, and then we reign on earth with the Jews and with Jesus. Like specific territory. Like they're their own thing, but yeah. Yep. Yeah. And then verse 25 to 28. So we're going a little bit on overtime today, but that's fine. So verse 25 to 28 talks about the coming of the Son of Man. So this again is talking about the Great Tribulation period. So all right. And then some verses I have for you guys. Excuse me. So, all right. So verses 25 to 26 is the Great Tribulation. 27 to 28 is talking about the second coming. And some verses for you guys to have as references that talks about this is Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 to 14. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 14 to 16. And then Zechariah, I gave it to you out of order. That's fine. Zechariah 14, verses 3 to 4. And then Zechariah chapter 2, verse 11. Okay, so just some verses for you guys. You can go back and read. That talks a little bit more about verses 25 to 28. And then verses 29 to 33 talks about the parable of the fig tree. Okay, so to kind of summarize this parable, what's being said is that when we see the signs, we will know that the time is near for Jesus to come for us. And this is also a double reference. So this is talking about our rapture, and then is talking about the second coming, which is for the Jews. So it's referring to both events. Mm-mm. So the rapture is the rapture, and then there's the Great Tribulation, which is the 7 years down here. We won't be here. And then the second coming is, well, first is the Battle of Armageddon, and then the second coming. So that's when we come down on earth, and then God, that's where he sees what Jews will actually be in heaven and what Jews would be going to hell with the rest of the people who are left behind. So that's what that's talking about. No, before. Yeah, because we're gonna be down here with him and the Jews for the 1,000-year reign. And then 33 talks about that heaven and earth will be one. The kingdom of heaven will come down and we will be on earth with Jesus. So that's talking about after the second coming, when everything that's in heaven comes down, including us, and earth and heaven will be joined as one. And then 34 to 38 talks about the importance of watching. The importance, the importance of watching. So, to pretty much sum up 34 to 38, Jesus is saying that we need to watch ourselves, pay attention to our salvation, and make sure that we are not losing ourselves with the cares of this world, because the rapture is coming. So we basically have to watch for our salvation. That's what verse 34 to 38 is talking about. Any questions with everything that we went over for today's class? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He creates a new, I want to say like a new world. I don't know the right word to say. It's because heaven comes down. No. That's after the 1,000 years. Yeah. Any questions? So that's going to be in heaven. So that's so that's going to happen during the tribulational period. So that happens after the rapture. So when we're in heaven, that's when we'll see the streets of gold, our mansions, the jewels, all that cool stuff. And then when heaven comes down, everything that we have in heaven comes down with us. Well, yeah, it's going to be better. We're not going to have concrete. It's gold. All right. So for next week, I'm gonna give you guys your reading for next week. So it's the same location, but everything is new from the inside out. Yes and no. So the main location we're gonna be when we come down from heaven is gonna be Jerusalem, since that's technically like the capital, and that's where God's throne is going to be. Um, so for next week's reading, so I'm gonna have you guys read Mark 13 and 14, and then Matthew 24, 25, and 26. Okay, so that's Mark 13 and 14, and then Matthew 24, 25, and 26. So again, it's kind of similar to how it was this week. A lot of the sections are the same. Still, make sure you guys read it thoroughly, but we're going to start getting into Jesus, or God, because it's going to be in red. God talking more about the end times, is going to talk about Judas's betrayal. It's going to start getting into all that stuff. So make sure you guys read those 5 chapters. For those who are on YouTube, thank you guys for joining. If you guys have any other questions, you can always comment below, and we'll try to answer them during next week's class. And we will see you next Wednesday at 7 o'clock.